The government has yet to set a date for its fall fiscal update, but that's certainly coming soon. Today we had another snapshot of how Canada's economy is faring and its effect on how governments tax and spend. The Parliamentary Budget Officer says growth has been stronger than expected, even with the uncertainty over tariffs and trade. But that doesn't mean the federal government is any closer to balancing the budget. In fact, the PBO projects the deficit will be even higher over the next couple of years. Joining me now to go deeper into the numbers is Canada's new Parliamentary Budget Officer, Yves Giroux. Mr. Giroux, good to see you.
Thank you.
Been in the job now just a few weeks, so it's good to have you for the first time in our studios here at CPAC. And I think typically in the past with Parliamentary Budget Officers, you'll be a frequent visitor because every time you have something to say, we, on behalf of Canadians, are interested in it. So welcome today.
Thank you very much, and I look forward to coming back.
Good. Well, we'll have you back. Let's start with your fiscal outlook that you've unveiled today. Anticipating the federal deficit to hit $19.1 billion this fiscal year, which is over $1 billion higher than the government projected in last spring's budget. And for 2019-20, you're projecting nearly $4 billion more in deficit compared to the government's projection. What's behind those increases?
Well, in good parts, it's additional expenditures because revenues keep growing. So if revenues keep growing and the deficit is widening, it has to be because expenditures, and that's what we're seeing. Expenditures are growing at a good pace, especially in the last few years, and we expect that trend to continue at least for the next year or two.
And do you identify which expenditures? Where is the government putting its money?
It's mostly direct program expenditures, so it's expenditures from departments and agencies. So we haven't done the fine analysis as to which specific departments and agencies are seeing the biggest increases, because the report was to provide a picture of the outlook, the general outlook, but it's direct program expenditures. Of course, transfers to other levels of government and transfers to persons are also increasing, but these are by and large legislated programs, so they're following their due course as set out in legislation.
Right, so that people understand, is there a distinction between, so some of these are elective choices that the government is spending more money on, some of them are mandated choices where the money has to go?
Yes.
Okay.
So legislated programs, transfers to provinces, for example, transfers to individuals, old age security, employment insurance, and these are legislated, demand-driven. The government has very little discretion on a year-to-year basis without resorting to legislation. Where we're seeing the growth is direct program expenditure. That's where the government has more discretion.
Okay. How much is it a factor of the government's recent change to how it calculates revenue and expenses, and how much is a factor of just the increased spending?
It's mostly the increased spending.
Okay.
It's not
a budget methodology.
No, there's been a small change. Well, I shouldn't say a small change. There's been a change in the way the government accounts for its obligations regarding public servants' pensions, and that in one fell swoop on Friday, it increased the national debt by $20 billion, and it increased the deficit by $500 million. But we're not talking about these types of changes.
Okay. The Bank of Canada is expected to once again raise interest rates this week in an attempt to keep the Canadian economy from overheating beyond capacity and to fight inflation. So what's the danger of a government continuing to run deficits with the kind of economic growth we've had?
The danger is obviously overheating the Canadian economy. When the economy is already operating at or above its full-time, long-term potential, the risk by increasing government expenditures is that the government will provoke inflation or will fuel the inflation, which will push the bank into taming it down by increasing interest rates. And with the good conduct of the economy, or the way the economy is behaving right now, very solid employment gains, solid growth, and the government spending money, increasing its spending, the risk is that we'll see a resurgence of inflation. Well, we've already seen it, and the risk is that it'll continue if the government keeps on increasing spending. Although that's not what we're anticipating, but it would be a risk.
All right. So for me and other average people watching, are you suggesting that the government is overspending now? The government needs to be careful because it's now overheating the economy.
Well, it's a matter of policy choices. So I'm not in the business of providing policy advice. That's the role of cabinet, government, and MPs and senators to advise the government and to reflect the will of the people. But there's always a risk when the economy is doing very well. If the government increases its expenditures, it will provoke overheating. I don't think we are yet at a critical point. and I don't see any plans for the government to massively increase its spending. But if that was the case, there would be a risk of increasing inflation.
Okay, you calculate there's a 10% chance of a balanced budget by 2021 and a 30% chance of a balanced budget by 2023. How do you arrive at those numbers? And is it now just a question of political priorities? It's so you can choose to actually bring that deficit down and balance that budget on that timeline or not? It's just a political choice.
Well, how we calculate that, we run a number of simulations with adjusting some factors, and we see, based on a wide number of simulations, what's the proportion that lead to a balanced budget or a surplus. And we find that there's about a 10% chance by 2021, as you mentioned. Of course, if the government decided, come hell or high water, as we've heard years and years ago, that it wants to balance the budget, the government could balance the budget, but it would imply rather tough policy choices when you're faced with a $19 billion deficit. So it would mean reducing expenditures, and we're not factoring that in. Our simulations assume status quo or known policy actions continue. And it's just a matter, when we say 10%, it would be a confluence of good events. For example, better than expected exports, lower imports, strong consumer spending, strong business investment. And the chances of all these things happening at once are relatively slim. That's why we put a 10% chance of that happening.
Okay, the big economic story in Canada these days has been the trade talks with the United States and some of the continuing issues associated with that, the cross-border tariffs on steel and aluminum. How are those issues affecting the country's fiscal health?
They are having an impact, and we believe that if these actions continue into the future, they will subtract 0.25% to the GDP, the level of the GDP, by 2022, if I'm not mistaken. So that sounds small when we express that as a percentage in percentage terms, but it is still billions of dollars. So if these were to continue, they could have a material. 0.25 is material to the absolute level of GDP, especially for people who work in the industries that are affected.
Right, so that's just a reinforcement that the tariffs make a difference. They hurt the general economy.
Yes, and they hurt specific sectors, and these sectors, while the trade action is limited to sectors, it has a meaningful impact for the broader economy.
Okay, been a big political debate about whether U.S. tax cuts and deregulation will hurt business investment and corporate tax revenue in this country. What do you project?
It will have an impact, but we say that it won't have a material impact. And that sounds a bit counterintuitive because people are worried about that, of course. But one thing to keep in mind is that tax rates are just one of many factors affecting businesses' decisions to invest in a country versus another. The availability of the labor force, stability of the country, good infrastructure are all factors that play an important role in business investment decisions. The tax rate is obviously one, but the reverse argument could be made that if taxes were such a big determinant factor, given that the U.S. had a higher tax rate than Canada for a number of years, there would be no businesses left in the U.S. and they would all have moved to Canada, which is obviously not what happened. So with the tax advantage moving in favor of the U.S., we don't anticipate that there will be a huge, massive shift of businesses out of Canada into the U.S. It will have an impact, but not a material impact.
All right. Yves Giroux is Canada's new Parliamentary Budget Officer. Thanks for spending some time with me today. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.